Good morning, and welcome to a very special edition of The Morning Charge. So if you happen to be joining us after having seen In the Company of Giants, our context-only special episode of last week, Wednesday, August 1st, we released an episode just for our social media connections. Those of us who are on Facebook together or LinkedIn or any of the social networks that I'm on, you probably had access to a link for this particular episode. If you aren't part of my network right now, please do connect to me either on a Reyactive or a Chris Care social network, and I'll be happy to forward the link to you. Or if you go directly to Facebook, the Reyactive account, you'll see the link right there, and you can sign up to either be a friend or like the page, and you'll get access to it either way really quickly. So today's episode, and the next 6 episodes including today, are an expansion of what content we included there. We started by talking a little bit about, well actually the whole episode was about my social network connections on LinkedIn in particular, and how those translated to my other social networks. That doesn't sound like a big deal until you realize that the people I was talking about are the top 300 most connected people on LinkedIn, anywhere in the world. And of those people, it turns out, from my research, that I'm connected on a first-degree basis with 85% of them. And of all 300 top most connected people on LinkedIn, I'm first or secondary connected to them one way or the other. Now that starts to make a little more of an impression, and it seems to be a little more significant when you consider that that's 300 out of 174 million. And that 300 people is a very tight-knit, closely connected and interconnected group of people. Not that they're in each other's pockets, not that they do business with each other necessarily, but they are all interconnected. And it's a very important segue into what the next 6 episodes are all about, which is what the real impact and what the real use of social media is. Not simply putting a fan page up and making sure people go to it. We've all seen very mixed results based on that alone. What we're going to share is groundbreaking. I've gone off and I've found a whole variety of different research sites and different materials with really eye-popping statistics and information that changes the entire game plan as to what social media you want to be using, which ones are currently working the best, and where they work in the first place. It's a much different school of thought than most of us would ever expect. And certainly most of my very professional social media friends and connections largely are going to be flabbergasted by some of these details. Just so that you don't think I'm asking you to take my word for it, I'm going to go ahead and leave or provide the information for where I got those research results, so you can look them up for yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. It's not just based on my personal say-so. This is information that comes from top research agencies and organizations from all over the world. You'll be able to get it just like I did firsthand. So that said, we're going to get underway just shortly. So before I do that, I wanted to thank you once again for joining us on this very special 6-episode series called Social Revelations. So we're kicking off the first episode of Social Revelations, our special series on social media, and I'm going to get straight into some of the stats that are just going to blow your mind. So that we're all on the same playing field, this is the time to take whatever you think you know about social media, throw it out the window, put it on pause, leave it off to talk to itself in a corner for a while, because you need to get this information in your heads first, then interpret it any way you want after that. But get this information in first. So we're going to get straight into some of these particular details. So I'm going to go straight in here and get to my desktop. Actually, no, it's over here. And I want to talk to you about the differences where each of us think certain social media rank in the scheme of things and where they really are. So one of the things that kind of triggered this was an article I wrote for the website Social Media Today. Very popular. It's really the creme de la creme. It's kind of on a par in my books with Mashable for the most significant content on social media out there right now. And what Social Media Today kind of allowed me to do is to write an article on social media traffic. And I'm just going to go directly to that site. And this is the article that I wrote. So thankfully, a lot of people have seen the article. Hopefully a bunch of you have. As this article comes up, we'll talk about it for just a second, where my goal is to talk to you and share the details of what sites are important in considering for your social media strategy. I don't really care how many social media experts you talk to. You're probably going to find 90 to 95% of them really talk about the core three, maybe the core four, as far as they see them, which would typically be Facebook, Twitter, maybe YouTube, maybe LinkedIn if they really have to stretch. And that tends to be where the thinking stops. It doesn't go beyond that. And we're going to cover those, and they're important social media. They do drive a lot of traffic. But from this chart from StatCounter Global Stats, and if you go to statcounter.com, you can look this up in real time and see it for yourself. What this shows is this is Facebook's trend. And it's pretty rocky. For 2011, not only was it on a downward slope, but another site drove a lot more traffic than Facebook really ever has in any one period of time. That site has now kind of fallen off its trajectory, and it is on a downward spiral, but it's still the number 2 traffic generating site globally, and that particular site is Stumbleupon. You may or may not have even heard of Stumbleupon, but it actually, for all of 2011, generated a lot more traffic than Facebook did. And it's still the number 2 traffic generating site in the world. So something you really want to pay attention to is which of these sites make more sense for your business. Now right now, Facebook, king of the heap, it's got 47% lion's share of the market. Very cool, very positive. But you'll also see that since about March, it started its downward trend again. And all of the stats that you're seeing in the media today about Facebook really support the fact that it is on that downward trend. They've found that 83 million of the Facebook users that are listed are fake accounts. They're finding that 600,000 accounts are hacked every day. Basically, there are security issues with 600,000 accounts a day. It doesn't take very long, even if you have almost 1 billion accounts, before that number reaches everybody. So it's an important thing to look at in terms of the trajectory for Facebook. The advertising revenues are dropping, stock prices dropping, interest levels dropping. The advertising rates are all based on a certain number of click-throughs, and they're finding 80% of them could be clicked by bots rather than people. This is not a rosy picture for Facebook. It doesn't mean that Facebook still isn't the number 1 dog in the race, but it's on a downward trend right now, not an upward trend. When you take a look at Stumbleupon, it's on a downward trend too, but it seems like it might be going this trajectory here. It's kind of in a slow curve at the moment, but it was on a very sharp descent. So maybe they're doing something to right the ship, or maybe they're just dying out. You never know. Either way, they're still the number 2 generating traffic site out of all the social media out there. Number 3 is Pinterest. Well, actually, sorry, number 3 is YouTube, just a little bit ahead of Pinterest. So notice that between Facebook and Twitter, you already have Stumbleupon, YouTube, Pinterest, and Reddit is this gray line down here. Then you get to Twitter. In fact, there's some statistics that show that really there's only about 5% of Twitter that has any commercial success relevance at all. but there's conflicting stats on that, and we'll get to that later. Even so, Twitter is responsible for a massive amount of change in the world. So it has a huge impact. It was able to coordinate reactions during the Arab Spring last year. It has had impact in terms of social media events, flash mobs, and a variety of other things that have had social and cultural change in big ways. So there's no telling how much oomph Twitter has, but you need to correlate that to all the other sites out there and gross traffic. But putting it another way, if Facebook is this monster king of all traffic, so to speak, and with that amount of traffic, Pinterest, this black line right here, generates 4 times as much retail buying traffic as Facebook. Maybe the sheer volume of Facebook isn't enough to make that the reason to be on Facebook. Maybe we need to look at these in greater detail. So I took the opportunity to go get that greater detail. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So I really hope you take the opportunity to go to socialmediatoday.com and take a look at this particular article, because it will give you much deeper understanding, or at least it'll frame it a little more contextually for you. And it talks about the differences in the impacts between Facebook and Twitter and Reddit and the Stumbleupons and others that are listed on there. What I want to do is take from that one specific point, and that's that the pecking order, the hierarchy of pure traffic, the way most of us think about it, isn't true. It's not necessarily true that Facebook, Twitter, YouTube are the top 3. Really, they aren't. Facebook is number 1 today, but it wasn't a year ago, and it looks like it's on the decline right now. So by the end of 2012, maybe it'll be back down to number 2 again, or number 3. It's not a given either way. Also, others that you probably never even interacted with or never heard of were driving more traffic last year than Facebook was, or are currently driving a lot more traffic than Twitter. And regardless of how much traffic they're driving, in the areas that count, maybe none of these are the ones that you want to be dealing with. The example being Pinterest. So take a look at the article. It'll give you a little more insight. And now we're going to move on with that understanding that the rankings of social media aren't what they're cracked up to be. That there's a big difference between what we socially accept to be true, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube rule, and what is actually true, and not necessarily any of those. YouTube might be an exception, but we'll get into that later. So right now we're going to go take a look at more data about Facebook, Stumbleupon, and LinkedIn specifically, and we're going to do a direct comparison based on their traffic. So taking a look at Facebook's traffic. So Facebook's search traffic, this is based on stats from Google. And remember, all of this data that we're seeing as of right now comes from the research of a group called Ignite Social Media. And if you go to IgniteSocialMedia.com, every year they come out with a new research platform or research summary that comes directly from their research from Google. They get the data straight out of Google, they process it, and post it. There's not a lot of monkeying around. Well, now, if you take a look at the results of 2012, you're going to see some very interesting graphs. And I'm going to start with the Facebook search traffic graph. And as I was saying, Ignite has a very specific way of doing this comparison. Whatever the highest point is, is considered to be 100. Everything else is then graded off that or reflective of that. So the highest point that Facebook has had so far, according to the data that goes till April 1st, 2012, would have been somewhere around the end of 2011 or January 1st, 2012. Somewhere in there was the top performance for Facebook. And if you take a look at the growth pattern, it really looks like Facebook had this wonderful incline, but now it's plateaued and it might even be declining. And if you compare that to the graph that we just saw, that matches and correlates reasonably well. It's that starting to taper off, not quite looking to be on that same climb rate that it was before. Can it turn it around? Sure, but at the moment it's looking more decline than incline. But it's still got a big chunk of its traffic. It's maintained most of its traffic growth according to this chart. Now we're going to flip over to LinkedIn. LinkedIn has a very different graph. In this case, it's had that slow, steady incline, and it's just surging. It keeps growing and growing. So the highest point it's ever had was at the end of its cycle for this set of stats, which in this case was March 4th of 2012. But nothing is showing that it's dropping off. It's only on the incline at the moment. Very interesting stat, especially since LinkedIn didn't make the top 7 for traffic generators that we saw on the previous stat counter graph. Even though it's on this big growth rate, and we know it's got 174 million users, LinkedIn still doesn't meet the requirements for that top 7 rating. So, although it's growing, and it's growing very well, we got to take that in consideration. Now we're going to go ahead to Stumbleupon. No, that's not it. Just a second. There we go. Now Stumbleupon has yet a different kind of a graph. It did the plateau, big growth. Plateau, big growth. Now it's got a big drop. Well, that correlates directly to what we saw on the other graph as well. So both of these search traffic patterns look very similar to what we saw as far as growth patterns for Stumbleupon and Facebook. What does that mean? Well, it just validates some of that data, but it shows you what's happening. And you get to see a direct comparison from one to the next. Now I'm going to back this up a little bit and start talking about what makes each of these social media important. Because realistically, it doesn't really matter if they drop from 1 billion to 700 million users in the case of Facebook, or if it happens to go Stumbleupon does an equivalent sort of a thing. You're still talking about hundreds of millions of users. There's enough volume of traffic there to fund just about any business out there if it's the right traffic. That's the point that Pinterest has made. It may only be the 3rd or 4th largest volume of traffic, but it's by far the most commercially beneficial for anybody doing retail. So if you take a look at the demographics then, who uses these? Well, let's start with Stumbleupon because I'm here. And let's start by identifying where this traffic comes from. And I think this is where you're going to see some big surprises. Top regions for Stumbleupon. Well, Stumbleupon, the #1 most saturated country for Stumbleupon is Ireland. And again, remember, whatever the #1 country is going to be counted as 100, and all the other countries are going to be based off that. This isn't sheer volume, this is how saturated that country is. In other words, what percentage of users use Stumbleupon in comparison to other countries. So, in this case, a lot more people use it in Ireland than the US, so you have much more likely of an impact in Ireland than the US. Still, US is number 2, at roughly 2/3 of the traffic of, or 2/3 of the saturation of Ireland. Canada is next, New Zealand, etc. So largely a Western world, Anglophone, English-speaking group that uses this. I'm going to skip back, and we're going to take a look at locations for LinkedIn. Now we have quite a different pool, don't we? Netherlands is top, India is number 2, UK is number 3, and the US is effectively quite a distant number 4, and Ireland is number 5. Volume-wise, that's showing that still Western world is in the top 5, and it's highly represented, but the Netherlands and India are really using LinkedIn to maximum benefit. They see potential in here, and they're using it. Even though the vast majority of the work on it is in English, you can have multilingual pages on LinkedIn, and that's part of what makes it so useful for some of these other countries. Before I leave that, though, I wanted to make one point very clear. Stumbleupon, Ireland was number 1. LinkedIn, Ireland is number 5. Now I'm going to go back to Facebook, and Facebook is completely different. The number 1 most saturated country for usage is Turkey. Then Tunisia, Venezuela, Albania, Colombia, Italy, Serbia, Malaysia, and on and on and on. And the first real Western country that even has a kick at this might be Italy. Mexico. In fact, there's not a single English-speaking country on this list. The US is so far down the list, it doesn't crack the top 21. It's not to say there isn't a large volume of users in the US, but percentage-wise, that number of users gets drowned out by all the other stuff that's happening on the internet. Whereas the rest of these countries, in Turkey, they get their news, they do their work, they get their lives, their social lives take place on Facebook. So what does that mean? Well, it means you have a number of places that are producing statistics for Facebook that really don't have any value for the US market. It doesn't matter that there are 800, almost 900 million Facebook users if 850 million or 750 million of them aren't here in the US. If you're trying to sell in the US, the fact that it has hundreds of millions of extra users, that's wonderful, but it doesn't sell your product to them because they're not buyers of it if they're not relevant to your demographics. If you're not selling to Turkey or any of the top 21 countries there, Facebook has some limitations. And the volume of users on Facebook may be absolutely no different, effectively, than any of the other social media out there, including Stumbleupon. In fact, probably a lot less than Stumbleupon. Even with a big decline, remember Stumbleupon is still the number 2 most used or most effective traffic generator, and it had US as number 2, and Ireland as number 1. That's something you got to keep in mind, because they certainly have within range comparable numbers of users. And if that's the case, who are you selling to? You want to be where your buyers actually exist. So regions alone is a very interesting thing to study. Now I'm going to take it one better. I'm going to take a look at cities. Top cities for Facebook: Istanbul, Ankara, Caracas, Bogota, Rome, Milan, Buenos Aires, Mexico City, Paris, London. Now, this is a huge statistical role reversal. 2 years ago, maybe even as little as 1 year ago, the UK was about as involved in social media as rocks are in McDonald's hamburgers. They just didn't really have as big a connection to it as the US and largely a good chunk of the rest of the world. Germany was already embracing it. France was embracing it. Italy, Greece, they were all embracing it. But the UK really was just not... This wasn't their cup of tea. Already, the UK, London in particular, has surpassed any and every US city for saturation in Facebook. And given the size of London, that's a pretty big population to work with. And there's not a single US city on that. Not one. So if you're trying to market on Facebook, which is the top US city to market to? Well, we're going to have to do a little more digging on that because, realistically, there aren't that many great ones. Let's go take a look at some of the other features of Facebook's users. And this is globally. 10%, less than high school. A little less than that, kind of 9.5%, have high school. 60% have at least some college. Maybe 14 or 15% have a bachelor's, and probably 6% have a graduate degree. So most of this is in the some college area. So we're thinking, right, just from the stat, we're talking college students, blah, 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 that the same stuff that the Facebook movie talked about, right? Let's dig into that a little bit. Age. No, it's not the 20-somethings that are all over Facebook. It's the 45 to 54-year-olds. They represent a third of all Facebook users. And then 35 to 44 is the next biggest group, and it's got about 22, 23%. So between the two of these, well over half, almost two-thirds of all, well, if you include the 55 to 64, that's two-thirds of all users of Facebook. The 18 to 34 range that all the radio stations want to get, they're not on Facebook. Not by comparison. They don't care. They use it not to the same degree. So buying, this is an important demographic. This is the people who are making money. But college-wise, education-wise, it's maxed out largely at some college. So statistically, that usually represents a slightly lower income bracket. Well, let's take a look at that and see how that bears out. Income for Facebook users. Well, 50 to 75K is the largest number. That's a little over a third. The next third is 25 to 50K. So really we're talking about decent middle income America. Or middle income anywhere, really. This is all again presumed to be US dollars. And the extremes of wealthy and poor, not so much. But that middle income hits it pretty well. Who are the users otherwise? Well, gender-wise, it's 55-45, female to male. You'll see that stat come up fairly often. Nothing terribly weird or wonderful about that. That's the profile of a Facebook user. Probably not the profile you were expecting it to be. It's not the young 20-something that you saw in the movie. It's not the craft dinner crowd. It's the semi-professional, the median age, median worker, median income. For the US, at any rate. Now we're going to take a look at the others. So LinkedIn, what are the ages? Well, instead of it being biased towards the 45 to 54, this is much more biased on uneven. So it really is the full 35 to 54 bracket is the bulk of the users of LinkedIn. This is the bulk of your earning potential in life. So again, since it's a business-oriented site and a career site and a networking site, this makes a lot of sense. As you get into the workforce, that makes sense. The 18 to 24, 17, retirement age of 65 plus. Those who are kind of at this point in the boomer area, looking at what they're going to do as a second career, they might be interested, or they might be finding some other way of doing things. But they represent the smallest proportion of users, not likely even a third of users. But this is where the bulk of the LinkedIn crowd comes from. Top cities for LinkedIn: India, India, India. Netherlands, New York. Wait a minute. We didn't see any U.S. cities on the Facebook list. Not one. Here, we have New York. London's on both. That's an interesting point to note. Then we have Toronto and Chicago. This is a lot more along the lines of what Western businesses would be expecting. They do business with New York. They do business with Chicago. They do business with Toronto. They do business with a lot of these cities. Keep in mind, the number 1 through 3 are all India. But after that, within the top 10, you have at least 2 U.S. cities in Toronto, and then London kind of rounds it out. So if you're looking at social media for business users, and you're trying to market it to New York and Chicago, LinkedIn might be a really good benefit for you. It might be a good match. Let's keep looking for more information here. Again, we looked at age, we looked at income, we looked at cities. Education. Well, this is different than Facebook. Yes, some college, but between bachelor's and graduate, that's actually more. So you're looking at very little high school, less than high school, significantly less than what you found on Facebook, and you're seeing significantly more on a higher, more highly educated side of things. Gender, big difference again. Instead of it being a 55-45 split, you're seeing even Steven, 50-50 split between men and women. The income, again, largely in the 25 to 75K range, but instead of it being more on this one, it's more on this one. And there's a much bigger support in the 75 to 150K range. Much bigger numbers here. So comparing the two, already you're seeing bigger, more active, more integrated US markets for LinkedIn than Facebook. And numbers-wise, you're probably reaching a bigger percentage of that market using LinkedIn than Facebook, given how far down on the saturation point the US is compared to all the other countries. But wait, we're not done. Remember, we're going back to Stumbleupon. So the age range on Stumbleupon is much more averaged out. It reaches a lot of the younger crowd, the 18 to 24, right the way through to at least the 54 mark. Yeah, there are gaps and there are highlights, but all 4 of those are significant demographics there. So you're really looking at a much more generalized 18 to 54 range on Stumbleupon. Top cities, Ireland again, Toronto again, New York and London and Chicago again. And now Stumbleupon adds a third US city in Los Angeles. Are you seeing a trend here? Between those 3 sites, the number 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 American cities, or North American cities, all seem to be New York, Chicago, Toronto, and now LA. So if you're trying to market Miami and you're not on any of these lists, maybe these are not the right social media for you. And I'm going to leave it there for today, as far as those 3 stats are concerned, or those 3 sites are concerned. Because I think what we're seeing is some great information about that whole question of demographics. Who are you talking to? If you're really talking about 160 to 170 million US-based Facebook accounts, of which Facebook itself kind of expects that there's a proportion of those that are not necessarily duplicates, but for example, you have your individual page, then you have your fan page. You might have several fan pages depending on your brands. So if you carve that down to the appropriate size, you're probably looking at about 140, 130 million US-based Facebook users. And LinkedIn, you're probably looking at about 40 to 50 million US-based LinkedIn users. Stumbleupon, probably about the same or a little higher, maybe 80 million. Which ones are actually going to be doing the purchasing of your products and services? This changes all of those thoughts, because it doesn't matter about the 700 million other users if they're not in your demographic. It's a very interesting set of statistics. So tomorrow, we're going to get into the comparison between Reddit and Twitter. And we'll take a look at YouTube as well, and we'll get into some of the others. But I hope you found that this was just as interesting as I did. And you're going to take a look at this in terms of how you plan your social media campaigns, because targeting those cities and those countries might have a much bigger relevant impact than anything you've done before in social media. So that's the end of the episode for today. Again, my name is Chris Kerr, and this has been a very special starting episode series for The Morning Charge, and part of our 6-part series called Social Revelations. And I hope you found it as revealing as I did. Thanks so much for your time, and look forward to sharing with you a whole new batch of stats for tomorrow's episode.